everyone, this is Rob with smallformfactor.net, and welcome to the first episode of our CPU cooler shootout. For the first episode, we're going to be looking at the ID Cooling IS40V3, which you might notice is actually a discontinued cooler, but it is still relevant because it is available in the market in some places, and it is functionally identical to the newer IS40X, which differs only due to the colors of the radiator and the fan. The IS40V3 or X is a 45mm tall low-profile cooler with a 92mm fan that is about 15mm in thickness. It is mounted to the radiator using two fan clips. Because of this, we're also able to test the cooler with the Noctua NF-A9X14 fan, so we can get a good idea how the stock fan performs against a higher quality fan such as the Noctua, and also see if there's any gains in either thermal or acoustic performance by swapping out the fan. Of course, it would be silly to compare it just by itself, so we're also going to throw in stock coolers from both AMD and Intel for this test. The IS40V3 is a budget cooler. In some markets, you can find it for as low as $13, such as in China on Jingdong.com, while in the US it's around $25 on Newegg. When equipped with a Noctua fan, you can add about another $15 to $20 on top of that price. Because of this budget orientation, you'll notice that it has fan clips instead of screws to attach the fan, which I'm not particularly fond of, but they do work. But you'll also notice that the radiator fins are very loosely connected to the heat pipe. There's nothing actually connecting them there other than brute force, so they're quite easy to remove. Despite this, the cooler does perform quite well, so let's go ahead and take a look at the results now. Before going into the results, let's talk about the test methodology. All of our tests are run on an open air test bench. Ambient air temperatures are monitored near the intake of the fan to ensure that the ambient temps do not change more than 1 degree Celsius during the test. We run Cinebench R20 for 5 minutes total, for a total of 3 times for each test. With each run, we note the peak temperature during the test and then average them for the result. Generally, the peak number varies only about 2 degrees or so between runs, and if there is greater variation, we restart the test to see if the numbers still match or can be reproduced. After each run, we enter in our ambient temperature, peak CPU temperature as recorded in Hardware Monitor, and the fan speed, which was set using Argus Fan Monitor. We test this once on an AMD Ryzen R5 2400G, and then also on an Intel test bench using the i7-9700K, which is then set to specific TDP limits at 65 watts, 95 watts, and 125 watts. So in total, we are testing every cooler on 4 different systems, 5 different fan speeds, and 3 times each for a grand total of 60 times minimum, then multiplied by the number of fans tested with that cooler. Although this is not the perfect setup, as there are variables outside of our control, we are fairly confident in the reproducibility of these results using the same methods that we have given. With that out of the way, let's go into the results. On the chart here, you can see the curve of each cooler. As the fan speed decreases, the temperature increases, so you can see what the max performance is, as well as what it would perform like at lower speeds, if you're looking for something a little bit quieter. Obviously, we can see that the AMD Wraith Prism comes out in a commanding lead here. That's not really a big surprise considering how much larger it is than the other coolers, and even when you set the fan speed to 0 RPM or 0%, where the fan shuts off, it's still able to maintain 65 degrees Celsius above ambient air temperature. It was the only one actually to pass when set to the 0% fan speed. The Wraith Stealth also does perform quite well. It's limited to only 2000 RPM fan speed, but even at that number, it does come in a clear second place when looking at that fan speed, and it still even manages to beat out the ID Cooling IS40 even when it is running at a higher fan speed. So it is a very good showing from the Wraith Stealth there. The ID Cooling does pretty well with the stock fan, but I would recommend going to the Noctua fan if you have the budget for it. You can see there's a slight increase in performance, not a major one. You're only talking a couple degrees Celsius benefit, but it is a bit quieter, as we'll see later in the acoustical results. Moving over to our Intel results, we get similar numbers for the ID Cooling IS40. You can see that the stock fan doesn't perform quite as well as the Noctua at the same fan speeds, but you're only looking at about 1 or 2 degrees Celsius difference in temperature, so really not something that would be outside of the margin of error for these tests. Both do perform better than the Intel stock cooler at the similar fan speeds, although if you're talking about absolute performance, the Intel can ramp up over 3000 RPM, at which point it will match the ID Cooling's performance. And then obviously, like the Wraith Prism, Intel's TS15A high performance cooler outperforms all of them at similar fan speeds. And when you get that up to the peak fan speed of 3800 RPM, it has a very commanding lead. But even at lower RPM, it does outperform by about 5 degrees Celsius. Bumping things up to 95 watts, we get similar performance numbers. Again, the Intel stock cooler is able to match the IS40V3 when you're running at very high fan speeds, but of course, when compared to the same fan speed, it is running a bit hotter. And likewise, the Intel's TS15A high performance cooler does outperform all of those at similar fan speeds, and is able to run even lower if you crank that fan all the way up. And finally, at 125 watts, we see similar numbers. You get a little bit more difference or clear line between the Noctua equipped and the stock fan on the IS40. Still both are beating out the Intel stock cooler at the same fan speed, but the Intel cooler can run a little bit cooler if you ramp that fan all the way up. And then once again, the TS15A coming in the first place, although temperatures are much closer than they were at lower TDPs, but it still is enough to keep it in a clear lead over the others. It's important to consider both acoustical performance in addition to thermal performance. So let's take a look at the IS40V3's acoustical performance with both fans and then compare it with those stock coolers. Considering that it's running a lower fan speed than a lot of those stock coolers that we just listened to, it's a little bit surprising how loud this fan can get, but that's not too much of a surprise because it is a budget cooler after all. Just $12 on the Chinese market and $25 in the US. So if you're picking up one of these and you do care about noise, it'd definitely be worth considering picking up that Noctua fan as well. It's pretty easy to swap on. I do want to point out that the Noctua fan is available in 2 versions. So the beige and brown version that we showed you in this review is actually only available in a low speed version unless you buy one of the Noctua coolers. But if you do buy the Chromax fan, you can get the high speed version that we showed you here. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're looking to upgrade the fan on this. Well, that's all for this week. Next week, we're going to be taking a look at the ID Cooling IS50 and IS60. Both of those are 120 millimeter fan equipped low profile coolers. And we're going to go ahead and add those to our test bench as well. And we'll give you those results next week.